Mobile web anatomy. So this is a guide to basic visual mobile web. So this could be for apps. This can also be for your responsive websites when you get down to that, and when things shrink down onto the phone versus desktop, how things respond and how we can apply them. I did gear this a little bit more towards what we are working on, which is the taco restaurant. So I do want to just keep you guys to keep that in mind. There is obviously lots to know, but we're going to just kind of start here. Okay, so beginning with typography. So how to choose the right font for your mobile app. So you always want to figure out what your design goals are. We always want to consider the overall design style and mood, our current trends, and then think about the readability and the legibility. Here's a nice link to 20 best Google web fonts. There's lots of popular ones out there. Oh my goodness, that coffee is getting delivered. Thank you so much. So just keeping things like that in mind. You'd never want to go too crazy with your fonts, just because if they're not readily available to everyone, or if they're a bit tough to read, you're going to lose your users. So selecting the right font size. So the font size is another important factor that you should consider. But which font size is the most readable for apps, or which is the best font for mobile apps? According to a recent report, a 16-pixel font is considered to be the best for your eyes, and the minimum font size should be 12 pixels. Anything smaller and users will be squinting. Always be sure to choose a typeface that's clean and easy to read. So keep in mind, this is pixels. So we're not talking our points, because our point sizes vary from one font to another. A 10 point in a Helvetica font is different from a 10 point in another font. So we always want to look at pixel heights when we're doing that. This is not to scale. Our hierarchy and our typographic scale. So reviewing and grouping your information is a very important step. Once you've selected your fonts, at this time, you're going to decide your sizing for your headings. So you usually have a main heading, a subhead, which is usually called an H1. A subhead would be an H2. There might be an H3. And then you get into your body copy size. Maybe there might be a little bit of a larger body copy, and then we get into the little nitty-gritty body copy. So generally on a smaller website or a smaller app, you won't go too much further than on H1, 2, and 3. It very well might stop at 2. And same with for your body copy. Probably won't go anywhere past 1 or 2. Again, it might just be 1 for body copy. It's up to you to decide. Just like our basic design principles, too many fonts, too many font sizes, and it just kind of looks a little bit wild and crazy. So you always want to make sure that things stay consistent. We don't want your user to be too surprised throughout. Predictability is kind of a key in web. So our navigation is kind of a big beast in our mobile. So there are 2 common ways to build navigation in a mobile site or an app. So one being a sticky footer that stays at the bottom. So think about your Facebook, your Instagram. I don't have TikTok, but I'm sure they have that. Pardon me. Sorry.
Bless you.
I'm muted. Thank you. I muted too late. So that's where this is. So usually those are represented with a little bit of type and an icon. Saying that, you don't want to have this filled with 5 different things, because everything gets a little bit too small. You don't get enough space between them. So you always have to keep that in mind, what's going to work best. In this instance, another one using a hamburger style menu that opens the navigation when it's clicked. This is usually at the top left or right. Things are kind of changing, and I get into that in the next slide. But this is what we call a hamburger menu. So when you click that, it opens up, and then you have a lot more areas to click through. This many options would most certainly not fit along the bottom, and that is not going to work for your app, your site, etc. So a couple good links here: a guide to a hamburger menu design and 8 top mobile menu design for your inspiration. So footer navigation, talking about that. So some argue certainly now that a footer navigation is the best design for mobile apps. This is because of thumb-driven design. you guys you can just think thumb driven design. Look at this first graphic, 49% of people work their phone with their thumbs. So this can be utilized with an icon style sticky footer or a hamburger style menu at the base. So you could take advantage of this thumb driven design and use a sticky footer, but you can also in fact have your hamburger menu at the bottom. Arguably a hamburger menu at the bottom is still a quite new feature, so it's not very intuitive to most users. So you're playing in new grounds there. So you kind of want to, if this is your client and you're going to argue that, you're going to want to have a good fighting chance as to why you believe that that's the most valuable spot for it. Mobile navigation. So it's best not to use text for navigation on mobile. So a big long, like if you imagine your actual desktop where you have your navigation going and your words going all the way across the top, as text can get too small and you're unable to add enough space between them. Commonly used menu for mobile is a graphic that expands into a larger navigation, as we discussed earlier. There are several variations to represent this. So a hamburger style menu being the most common. So that's this one here. Common graphics are best for accessibility, as you want to ensure your user knows how to use and access the menu navigation at all times. So these ones are all pretty commonly used. Again, hamburger is the most common. You will see probably sometimes now a little graphic in the top corner, and that's going to represent the mobile nav. But again, not super intuitive. If you're trying to gear to the masses, that might not be the best way to do it. So say, for instance, in our taco app, maybe it's like a taco graphic and you're like, that's kind of cool and kind of fun, but not everyone's going to intuitively know that that's where the navigation is. Expanded navigation. So once you click that hamburger menu, there are many ways the menu can pop up. You can get creative on various ways it can animate. So you can go from the top, the side, you can slide in, etc. Always keep in mind your font sizes along with spacing. So you don't want to have things, you don't want it to be like no line spacing between them, because then again, thinking about yourself, you want to just make sure you can click those with your fingers on a small screen. So always keep in mind your font sizes. I just read that, sorry. Thinking of space for your hands and fingers to click and select the menu items. So always putting yourself in the user's shoes first will help. And then that's where your testing also comes in handy. And then always provide your users a way to close the menu. So you always want to make sure there is an X to close. This does not have one, so that's not very intuitive. This one, I believe, doesn't look like it, but you might be able to swipe and do it. But again, not as intuitive to the masses. So always nice to have a little X for a closing menu. Working on a grid. So I'm not sure if you guys have tapped into grids quite yet in layout design. If you guys, anyone care to speak up?
Mitch taught us columns, but I don't think we really got into grids at all. Beyond like the first creative concepts class where we like sketched out a web page, but that was like very base level, and I don't think we really put a lot of thought into that at that point.
Gotcha. Thanks, Katrina, for that. So yeah, Mitch showing you guys if it was for a website, it could have been for print as well. Print, very important, especially if you think of big beefy documents. Thinking of a newspaper. If you look at a newspaper, everything's in 3 columns or 4 columns, 5 columns, etc. So it just helps the eyes it gives the eyes a little bit of a break when you're reading a lot of content. Everything is organized. That grid is so important, and especially in web. So a grid in web design is a division of the layout in either or sometimes both vertical and horizontal guidelines. I'm only going to probably talk more on vertical grid for you guys. It forms a basic structure skeleton of your user interface. You have margins, columns, and gutters. So looking at this site on its own, it's nice and clean. It's kind of, for lack of better terms, predictable. So you know that there's going to be some free space here. You know that these are going to be separated. But then as an example, this is what the grid is actually set up. So those pink lines overlaid on top, you can see how the website adheres to that grid. One of the most convenient grids for mobile interface is a 12-column grid. This grid allows you to work in an even and an odd number of elements. As designers, it's totally up to you guys to decide how many columns you want to work with in your site. This is just common and this is just a suggestion. So your margin, just like print, we have our margins, we have our columns, and then we have the gutter in between. So getting a little more into margins and gutters. So currently the minimum recommended margins for Android is an OS is 16 pixels. So think about that white space on the left and right hand side. You don't want things to go bleeding off the edge. It's a bit distracting. Again, think white space, think where we like, what we like as designers. This means that if you want to adhere to the system guidelines, the margin shouldn't be less than this value. So they shouldn't be less than 16, but they most certainly can be bigger. The gutters between the columns shouldn't be too large due to the small width of the columns. So you never really want to have almost like a checkered board. So you don't want to have, you know, if this was say 12 pixels, you don't want to have your gutter 12 pixels as well. Your gutter will be smaller than your actual columns. The gutters between the, oh, I read that, sorry. A recommended width for the gutters for a mobile is 12 column is a 8 pixel gutter. Whoopsies, went ahead. So you guys might have heard the term called onboarding. So onboarding is, if you think about when you download a new app, it opens up the screen and it's like, welcome to, what's an app? What's that? Candy Crush. Welcome to Candy Crush, the greatest game, you know, mind game in the world. And then you swipe through and then it gives you a little explanation on how the game works, how you connect with people online, etc. So those are onboarding screens. So what is onboarding? There are many ways to welcome new people to your website, app, or platform. Nowadays, creating a good onboarding welcome can be crucial to engage the users, catch their attention, and keep them engaged in your product. So again, onboarding is generally more so for an app versus when you land on a website. It's not to say it doesn't happen either. So the features of onboarding, generally onboarding screens are visually appealing. So they always include some illustrations and photos, as well as a clear way for users to get to the next screen, see where they are in the process and skip features. You know, sometimes you don't really want to watch all those introductory videos and you want to just kind of skip ahead. Perhaps how you feel in class with me, you might want to just skip right ahead. So you always want to include that for your users so you don't frustrate them. The idea is to welcome a user or show them how easy it is to use or sign up for the app and or register. So features like showing where you are in the process, this is largely represented with those little dots. We always have a way to go back, making sure that your first screen, don't have that back button on the first screen because there's no way to go back if it's screen number one. A way to kind of skip ahead and then a way to get to the next screen. Same here. This is another way you can kind of show where you are in the feature. So this almost is working like a clock. So it'll run through there. But again, a way to go back, a way to skip. So we can be very creative on how that can be done. Again, creative is good, but we always want to make sure it's still intuitive for your users. Then we get into some pop-ups. So a mobile pop-up can come in many varieties or offerings and options. It can range from a discount code to a sale ad to a marketing email grab, and also a way to specify items prior to adding to the cart, for example. Hint, hint, this is what we're going to get into. So note, you'll always want to ensure there is a way for a user to close a pop-up. So you always want to make sure that, you know, when you land on a website and, you know, it's like, sign up today for 10% off your first order, and you're like, I just want to look up something real quick. You need to make sure that you have a way to close that, a no thank you, perhaps, or an X. In this visual example, this is what we're going to be doing for our websites. Starting, I'll introduce that next week. A way to perhaps maybe special instructions, so no pickles, please, extra onions, something like that, and then perhaps a way to add to cart as well. So payment, depending on your product and client, you need to outline the shopping cart that fits the user's wants and needs. So tax, tips, fees, shippings, etc. So there's tons of UX and UI kits to help you outline and find the best one for your user. So again, we'll get into that once we get into wireframing. But again, this is, for instance, or for example, a food one. So we have the items in our cart, we have a total, tips, service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whew. So that was a bit of a mouthful, as always. But that is it for our lecture.